Today's lecture is going to be on the organisms in the phylum Annelida. We're going to be in the domain here Eukarya, the kingdom Animalia. It's the same domain and kingdom that we've been in for the last several months now. The phylum in this particular kingdom is the Annelida, the annelids. There are three classes in this particular phylum: the Oligochaeta, the Polychaeta, and the Hirudinea. Oligochaeta, that's a C-H-A-E-T-A, little Latin for you. The Polychaeta and Hirudinea. Those are the three classes we're going to look at. So again, how these notes work, we're going to be looking at the phylum Annelida first, and those particular characteristics that all of the annelids have that group them in this particular phylum. Once we do that, we'll then take a look at the oligochaetes and what makes them unique, those characteristics that put them into a separate class. Same thing for the polychaetes, and the Hirudinea will be our last group of organisms. So first up here will be those characteristics of the annelids. That name, annelid, means little rings. And all of these organisms that are in this particular group are made up of these very small circular structures that make the organism. It looks like, again, they're made up of a whole bunch of little rings all kind of stacked together. What scientists call that is segmentation. And segmentation for these particular organisms is their most distinctive feature. Kind of like those cnidocyte cells, those stinging cells that all of the cnidarians had. Well, these organisms all have very distinctive segmentation. There's about 15,000 species of these particular annelids, which is a huge group, and we classified them in those three different classes, the oligochaetes, polychaetes, and the Hirudinea, based upon the presence or absence of two specific structures. That's how we group these organisms. Those two particular structures are the setae and the parapodia. Setae is spelled S-E-T-A-E. That's these little bristle-like structures that stick out of the sides of these organisms. A little bit tough to see in this one, but you can see these little kind of fuzzy things sticking out of the sides. Those help them in movement. We'll talk about that here in just a moment. They also have structures, the second one for that classification, called the parapodia. The parapodia are foot-like projections, these fleshy protrusions. And you can clearly see these up here and down over here, these fleshy protrusions that are sticking out of the side of this particular organism. So each of these segments has a pair of these particular parapodia that stick out to the side. So when we look at these different species of organisms, those 15,000 that I mentioned, what we're looking for as scientists are something to help us group them together so we can kind of understand how they live a bit better. Some of these organisms have these structures, others don't, others have some of them, not all. So that's what we use to actually group these particular organisms together. Their symmetry, one of those particular characteristics that we're using to define all of these different groups of animals, is that they are bilaterally symmetrical. That is, they are cephalized, they have a very distinct head region. Their body cavity. Remember we talked about body cavity first in those three cell-layered organisms that we called the platyhelminthes. Those are the flatworms. Then we started talking about them in the nematoda and rotifera. Nematodes are roundworms, that is, they are round. So these two organisms have a little bit different kind of body cavity. Flatworms, it's acoelomate. They do not have a coelom, they do not have that body cavity. But the roundworms, the nematoda, there's some space in there. But it's not a true body cavity. That is, they have the ectoderm, they have mesoderm, then they have the space, then they have the endoderm making up the gut. That's what we call a pseudocoelomate, P-S-E-U. We talked about that in our last lecture. These organisms are the first ones with a true coelom. That is, they have the ectoderm, the outside layer of cells, skin cells, etc. They have mesoderm, forms the muscle. They have body cavity, a space. They have another layer of mesoderm, and that layer is wrapped around the endoderm, that gut. That's really important because these particular organisms can digest their food, move their nutrients through the body without having to also move around. The nematode have to move around in order to get those nutrients up through that body. So having that true coelom, these are what we call coelomate organisms, is a huge evolutionary advance. Now there's more space, there's more ability for these organisms to move around, eat, stop, still being able to digest their particular food. They are more of what we call a tube within a tube type of organism. Now, the skeleton, again, they're worms, so we're not talking about organisms that have a hard outside skeleton and exoskeleton, or a hard endoskeleton, a skeleton on the inside. These guys have that same hydrostatic skeleton, that is, they use water to give their body support. Their digestive system is very, 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 very unique. They do have a one-way gut. We'll talk about the digestive system when we talk about the oligochaetes, using them kind of as an example. So one-way gut for all of these annelids. The circulatory system, again, another new structure, more advanced than some of these other ones. They do have a way of circulating nutrients around the body. They have a closed circulatory system. That is, they have vessels. They even have, and this is kind of cool, they have heart-like structures. They have 5 what we call aortic arches that help to pump that fluid through the organism. So we'll talk a little bit more about those here when we talk about the oligochaetes. So the class Oligochaeta is the first class that we're going to be looking at today of all of these different annelids. Their lifestyle, how these particular organisms are living. Generally, we find these living in soil or fresh water. So we're a little bit more familiar with the organisms in this particular class than we are in some of the other ones. Unique structure-wise, they do not have any parapodia. No fleshy projections that are sticking out of the sides of these particular organisms. However, they do have some setae, not very many. Their name, Oligochaeta, actually the oligo is few and the chaeta is bristles. So these are few bristles for these particular organisms. When we look at the individual segments of these, there are just a few bristles on each one, a couple on one side and a couple on the other side of these particular kinds of organisms. The most familiar one is our friend the earthworm. You know, the one that you see on the sidewalks and on the driveways after a heavy rain, they're coming out. So we're going to use this earthworm, since we are a little familiar with them for most people, kind of as the example organism for all of the annelids. And so we'll talk a little bit more here about these particular ones. Locomotion, how these guys move, is really, really, really unique. It's different than some of these other organisms. They have 2 kinds of muscles, circular muscles and longitudinal muscles. And when these particular organisms move, think about an earthworm, it's in the soil. Here's how they move. They have these circular muscles that are they're in a circle, and they're going to squeeze around the body of that organism. When they squeeze around the body of that organism, it pushes all the fluid in the coelom that they're using as that hydrostatic skeleton. It pushes that forward. So when this gets squeezed around here, it elongates the worm, makes it long and skinny. Well, the middle areas in here with their setae, these little teeny tiny bristles that are sticking out, kind of hold on to the sides of that burrow that they're in. So this front part squeezes down with those circular muscles, gets it pushed forward. Then the longitudinal muscles, the long muscles, running the length of the body here, once this squeezed down, these long muscles are going to then pull the rest of the body up to the front. And then the circular muscles squeeze down again. And the long muscles pull the rest of the body up. So as it squeezes and squishes it forward, it'll pull the rest of that organism up behind it. So they use this combination of these circular muscles and these longitudinal muscles to squish themselves forward and pull themselves up, squish themselves forward and pull themselves up. Digestive system, very unique. I'm going to ask that you know all of the parts of this digestive system from the anterior all the way to the posterior. And you'll see in the lab that we're going to be doing, this is what we're looking at in the lab. One of the main things is this particular digestive system. So, here's the first part. They have this little fleshy projection that actually kind of hangs over their mouth. That fleshy projection is called a Prostomium. Prostomium. Sound it out. P-R-O-S-T-O-M-I-U-M. Prostomium. It's kind of like a little lip. So they have this little lip that kind of hangs over their mouth. When they want to eat, they have to lift this lip up, and then we have the mouth. After that, prostomium. Well, in order to actually pull in for the earthworm's soil and the organic material that's in that soil, they need some muscular action that actually can pull that in. Well, they have a pharynx, just like those flatworms do. But this pharynx doesn't stick out. The pharynx is right behind the mouth. So we have the prostomium, we have the mouth, then we have the pharynx. After it sucks it in, there's a long tube that it's going to travel down. And this long tube is called an esophagus. Hey, we have one of those, a long tube after our mouth that the food travels down. Gosh, that's weird. Maybe it's not so weird. Maybe it does the exact same thing in these organisms as it does in us. It takes the food past the main circulatory and respiratory system, our heart and lungs. They don't have a stomach, however. Our esophagus takes our food to our stomach. They do not. Instead, they have this kind of bag-like holding area. It's called a crop. This crop holds the food. So they're sucking in all of this dirt and the organic material in the dirt, travels through the esophagus, and kind of piles up inside this crop. Once the crop is full, the mesoderm, the muscles that are lining this intestinal system, are going to squeeze that crop just a little bit, and it's going to pass into the gizzard. And the gizzard, you can kind of see this a little bit better in this view down here, mouth, muscular pharynx, lung, esophagus, crop, and the gizzard right here is this muscular organ, very similar to the mastax in those rotifers, except this one, we call it the grinding organ, grinding for gizzard, those two G's to help you remember. So we have the prostomium, we have the mouth, muscular pharynx pulls in the food, it travels through the long esophagus to the crop, to the gizzard. After the gizzard mashes it all up, then it passes into the intestine. And most of the rest of the organism is this intestine. At the end, any undigested, unabsorbed material, like the dirt itself, instead of the organic material, that dirt itself then passes out of the worm, out of the anus at the very end of the body. And those are parts of the digestive system. Let me run through them really quickly again. Prostomium is the lip. We have the mouth. Muscular pharynx pulls in the food. Food passes through the esophagus into the bag-like crop. From the bag-like crop, it goes into the grinding organ, the gizzard, and the grinding organ grinds it all up and then pushes it into the intestine where it's absorbed and the undigested material passes out of the anus. That is a hugely important part of what we're going to be looking at when we actually dissect these particular organisms in our next class period. A little bit more about some of these body systems. They do have circulatory and respiratory system, like I mentioned before. Their circulatory system, I said, is a closed circulatory system. That means that all of the circulatory fluid, they don't really have blood. It's called hemolymph, H-E-M-O-L-Y-M-P-H. Very similar to blood, but just technically not the same cells making it up. So this circulatory fluid is closed within vessels, just like ours is enclosed within vessels. They have a couple vessels. They have a ventral vessel and they have a dorsal vessel. In the ventral vessel, that's down the belly, so the bottom of the organism, the blood is going to flow in that ventral vessel towards the posterior end. When it reaches the posterior end, it returns in the dorsal vessel. How does it pump around in these two vessels? Well, this is where they have those 5 aortic arches. These 5 aortic arches are here. They're actually wrapped around the esophagus, which is exactly where our heart is, right around our esophagus. So there's some very distinctive similarities in the layout and the body plan of these particular organisms and many of the more advanced, more complex organisms. So these aortic arches contract and pump this blood from the dorsal vessel, to the second, the ventral vessel. Their respiratory system, how they get oxygen in, pretty easy, it's diffusion. So if you think about when it rains heavily and we have all of this water into the soil where these earthworms are living, well, now there's no space for them to allow this diffusion to happen. It's all water around it. Now, they do need some water, because that water helps with diffusion, but they need to have the oxygen around them also. That's why they come to the surface, to get away from all of that water. Sometimes they try to get away, and they get onto the cement. And then the rain stops. And then they can't get back, and they dry up, and we see them dead on the pavement. So these worms need to be able to get that oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the organism through that process of diffusion. Excretory systems, well, they have to get rid of waste in some way. Now, these particular organisms have what we call nephridia. Nephridia. Nephridia are the same structures that our kidneys have to help us to get rid of waste. These organisms use them a little bit differently. Nephridia are these little tubes that run basically through the muscle from the coelom, this body cavity where all of their organs are located. That's filled with fluid, providing that hydrostatic skeleton. Little tube that runs to the outside. And each and every single one of their segments has these nephridia. And so waste products, fluid that is built up, is able to move to the outside. Another reason why the water, when it rains tremendously, causes them problems. Because now they can't get rid of some of these waste products. Now, it's not waste like feces waste, but it's more like the waste products that we use as urine and get out of our body in that particular process. Ammonia and ammonia-type products are what they're getting rid of here through the nephridia in this excretory system. Now, the next system is the nervous system. We'll actually kind of take a look at the nervous system in the activity that we're going to do. It is made up of ganglia, which again are just bundles of nerve cells. We talked about those with the nematoda and with the platyhelminthes. The ganglia, a little bit different here. They do have cerebral ganglia located in the anterior portion, but then every single one of those segments has one little teeny grouping of cells, one small ganglia for each one of these particular segments. And they're all connected together in a ventral nerve cord. So each of these segments is controlled by the cerebral ganglia, sending signals to these other bundles of nerve cells. Very similar to our spinal cord, where we have these big groupings of cells running through our entire torso. We've got a very unique reproductive system and reproductive process for these particular organisms. They are hermaphroditic. That is, they have male and female organs in each individual, which is important because if you think about a worm cruising through the sediment, it might only find or bump into one other worm in its entire life. And if it finds and bumps into one other worm in its entire life, it had better be able to reproduce with that one. So if we had males and we had females, and two males bumped into each other, they wouldn't be able to reproduce. Two females bumping into each other wouldn't be able to reproduce. But if you have both, and you have both, when you bump into each other, able to reproduce. However, these guys are unable to fertilize themselves. So, when two worms meet, they rotate around, and they press their ventral surfaces up against each other in opposite directions. Once those ventral surfaces are pressed together, the setae, those little bristles, kind of hold themselves together for each of them. They secrete mucus from a structure called the clitellum. And the clitellum, some of you might have seen before, is this kind of thickened, fatter section of the body, usually slightly a different color on the worm, and usually it's located a little bit more towards the anterior portion of that worm. That thickened area secretes a tremendous amount of mucus. Now, once they're together and stuck together by all this mucus, each worm is going to secrete sperm. That sperm is then going to travel through that mucus until it reaches these openings where they have seminal receptacles. That's basically sperm receptacles, place for that sperm to be stored. Once that has happened and both of the worms have basically absorbed the sperm from the other, they'll detach, go on their way. The fertilization isn't going to occur yet. Several days after they have done this and shared their sperm, the clitellum secretes another mucus-like case, except this time it's a combination of mucus and carbohydrates and a little proteins, but mostly this carbohydrate called chitin. This chitin is spelled C-H-I-T-I-N. Really important carbohydrate, actually. And then as this particular worm will secrete this mucousy, chitinous substance, it forms this cocoon that slides forward, picks up the eggs, continues to slide forward, picks up the sperm, and as it comes off, pinches off, and now it's sealed tight. And inside are the eggs and the sperm, and that's when this fertilization occurs in this protective case. So now it has this little cocoon, the fertilized eggs in it. Those eggs eventually will form into small worms. Those worms, baby worms, are going to break out of that case, hatch, if you will, and now we have these small worms for the next generation. The next group here is the class Polychaeta. These ones are a little bit different. You might not be as familiar with the polychaetes. They're making up about 2/3 of all of the annelids. So when we talked about these particular organisms here, the oligochaetes and now the polychaetes, this is most of them. But you're unfamiliar with most of these because most of these particular organisms are all marine organisms living in the ocean, areas where it's tough for people to get into. Unique structures-wise, you can see some of these organisms here. All of them have numerous setae projecting from these parapodia. So they have both, the setae and the parapodia. And all this little white stuff that you can see here, those little white things are those setae projecting from that parapodia, sticking out. Locomotion-wise, how these particular organisms are moving around, you can see in this picture here, some of them, there's a couple. One worm down here, another one up here, a couple more over here. These are free swimming. So these guys will swim around in the water. Now, they're not very good at it, but they do use the circular and longitudinal muscles to kind of get themselves moving through that water. Some of these particular organisms secrete tubes or dig burrows. And so they're moving back and forth in their particular burrow using the setae and the parapodia as they are moving within those particular structures that they have secreted. Digestive system. In this particular graphic here, you'll notice that there are some very different kind of pictures here. These are all the heads of different types of these particular polychaetes. Their digestive system, same basic one-way gut. They've got the prostomium, they've got the mouth, the pharynx, esophagus, they have the crop, they have the gizzard, they have the intestines, they have the anus. However, some of these particular parts have been modified slightly. We have some antennae, sensory structures on this distinctive head, this cephalized area, so they can try and find food. Some of these guys have these structures modified into more like tentacles, so they can actually reach out and grab stuff. It all kind of depends on how they are living. We have those active ones swimming around. Those are active hunters. They've got some jaws on many of these particular species where they can actually grab a hold of the flesh of their prey and rip it and tear it and then suck it up using that pharynx. They can swim, not very well like I mentioned, but they can swim around. Some of these guys are what we call burrowing deposit feeders. That is, they will burrow into the sediment and then they will feed on stuff that has deposited or settled down to the bottom on that sediment. And then others are suspension feeders, sticking their antenna and tentacles up into the water column and taking things out of the water as it's floating before it gets down to the bottom. So we have some very different ways for them to actually access their food, and I'll show you some pictures of those here in just a second. Reproductive system-wise, they're very similar reproductive structures to that of the oligochaetes. These particular organisms are the only one class, Polychaeta, that have a larva. And that larva is called a trochophore larva. T-R-O-C-O-P-H-O-R-E, trochophore. And that's this guy right here. You can see there's some cilia wrapped around here. There's a distinctive mouth over here and anus. This is a very, very, very important larva to know because they share this larval type with another group of organisms, the mollusks. And we'll talk about mollusks in our next unit. Same exact larval type, which is hugely important when we look at the relationships and the evolutionary changes that have gone on between different groups of organisms. Because they have this larva, that is indirect development for this particular class, the polychaete. So make sure you have that dialed in for that reproduction, an important thing to remember. A couple examples I'd like to go through really quickly just so you can see some. Here's one here, and all the white on the edges. Those are the CT. Actually, a little bit of the parapodia, and then the CT is kind of where it gets a little fuzzy. That's a Nereis predator for this one. We've got some feather duster worms here and here, varying colors. These particular ones look like feather dusters. And they're some of those filter feeders, suspension feeders. We got the Spirorbidae, these little teeny white circles. These are really, really, really small, extraordinarily teeny little worms. They form this protective case. And then you can kind of see this one a little bit sticking out right there. We've got some other filter feeders, Catopterus, really cool one. That's this guy right up here. Kind of looks funky, but you can see the parapodia. And kind of act as paddles. These particular ones, they're called the parchment tube worm because the tube that they secrete feels very much like paper. We can actually simulate these. We can cut them out of their tube, put them in this plastic tubing, and watch them feed and survive pretty well. And it's cool to watch because these parapodia here move back and forth in this tube. And they're kind of going like this. And they pull water from one end to the other, so the water is moving through the tube. They secrete this big old huge cloudy mucousy net. And in that mucus, as the water's moving through it, any particles of food, other organisms, get caught in it, and then they're able to just swallow the mucus. And that's how they feed. We've got the innkeeper worm, this big guy right here, pretty substantial size worm. Some of these can run a couple feet long, about this big around, so I've seen some big ones of these innkeeper worms also living in these burrows. The last couple examples, oops, went the wrong way. Here we go. Let's get going here. The last couple examples, the Terabellids. These are spaghetti worms. That's this guy right over here. A green body. The little tan areas here, those are the parapodia, and they've got all these tentacles. It really looks like this little pile of spaghetti as the body's buried into the ground. This pile of spaghetti is sitting on top of it until you start seeing one of them move as they're searching for food that has fallen down. So this is an example of these Terabellids of a deposit feeder. And then we got one of my favorites here, that's Glycera. That's this guy right over here, bright pink. It's got this funky thing right here. This is actually its mouth. And it can evert its mouth. So most of the time it's in, but it can shoot its mouth out. And these guys are extraordinary predators. And when they shoot that mouth out, this is what the end looks like. All these four black things here, they're the jaws, and they're extraordinarily sharp. And they kind of pinch together. So when it shoots it out at a prey, it'll hit that prey, pinch that, and rip out flesh. These guys are, well, can we say extraordinarily nasty for a worm. The last group here, just a little bit on this particular class, the Hirudinea. These are 300 species, that's it, not very many. It's the smallest class of leeches. A good one for you guys to remember. Because a lot of people start thinking worms and then leeches come into it and they don't really know how they belong, what they're related to. Lifestyle for this smallest class, these particular ones typically are found in calm, fresh water. Not in rivers, but ponds, lakes, that calm type of water. Swamps, good place to find these particular organisms. Their unique structures is that they do not have any CT or parapodia. They lack both of those. So we have the oligochaetes that have no parapodia but bristles, polychaetes that have many bristles and the parapodia, and the Hirudinea have none of those particular organisms. They also have some suckers, which has to do with their locomotion. On each end, they have a sucker. So in this drawing, there's one here and one up here. So one surrounds the mouth, one surrounds the anus. Right behind the mouth, they have the pharynx. So in this particular one, that's going to be right down here on the bottom. They use those circular and longitudinal muscles to move. So the circular muscles, again, same kind of thing, squeezes down, they elongate. Longitudinal muscles pull up the rest of the body. So they can stick those suckers down, unstick one, circular muscles out, longitudinal muscles unstick, pull the body up. So they kind of inchworm along, or they can swim using those circular and longitudinal muscles with combination of those suckers. Digestive system, boom, there you go, some leeches on somebody's face. Look at that girl. Stick those things on there, they make little teeny incisions and they can suck out the blood, which is good if you get punched in the face and you have a big, huge bruise and you want to get that sucked out. One of the ways that for many, many years, boxers used to get their faces cleaned up really, really quickly by putting a leech on there and it would suck out the blood from those broken blood vessels. So they can eat blood. They can also suck down prey whole, if it's small shrimp, small fish, etc. They can suck those things in. But typically we think of these leeches as piercing the body and sucking out the blood. Now, not too many problems if they do that for some of these smaller leeches. They actually secrete this substance that's anti-clotting and acts as an anesthetic, so you don't even feel it when they do the little bite. And then once they're full, they'll let go and swim off somewhere else. But they can eat 10 times their weight in blood. That's a tremendous amount. They can swell up a whole bunch. Now for us, it's not going to cause us too many problems if they're eating a whole bunch. And you can pull them off, so she can pull these guys off. And I'll just have a little teeny tiny, it's like a little cut for a short amount of time. It'll heal up pretty good. For the reproductive system for these guys, extraordinarily similar to those oligochaetes, those earthworms. They have the catellum, they reproduce in a very similar way. So for the reproductive system, you should have it dialed in that these guys are just about the same as those oligochaetes. So the big differences for these guys, those unique structures, they do not have the setae or the parapodia. How they move, using those circular and longitudinal muscles with the suckers, and what they're eating. Just remember, for the Hirudinea, those leeches and this girl's face will be burned into your brain, and you'll be dialed in, ready to go. So next class period, we'll actually be doing a little lab where we're taking a look at these organisms. Be ready for it. It's a fun one.